Hello, everyone. Welcome to Bold Conjectures with Paras Chopra. Today, I'm with Ethan Perlstein, who is the founder and CEO of Perlara, the first biotech startup that's a public benefit company. Traditionally, organizations have either been for profit or non profit, but public benefit companies combine both of these approaches and pursue profits while making sure they have an explicit social impact like nonprofits. Ethan is an aspiring orphan drug discoverer, which we'll get into, evolutionary pharmacologist, and India scientist. He has a PhD in molecular and cell biology from Harvard University and was a Lewis Sigler Fellow at Princeton University. What I loved about Ethan's bio is the indie scientist part. I'm personally interested in science, but don't want to get into academia. So, this idea of pursuing science in a non traditional manner appeals to me a lot. Ethan believes that the future of science lies in what he calls decentralized bio, wherein anyone with an interest in science can participate and contribute to it without taking permission from the gatekeepers in the academia. He's trying to explore this exciting idea of decentralized science via his own startup, Perlara, and that is what we'll explore today. Welcome, Ethan.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ethan, let's begin with this phrase, indie scientist. So, who is an indie scientist and how did you become one?
Yeah, as you mentioned that term, I realized I think I might have traded up, and I'm now a company builder and a solo VC. But I still think both of those newer labels, capture that spirit that I think I was trying to convey with indie science, where ultimately I think I found my tribe in the world of startups. But even within startups, I feel like I wanted to not necessarily do the conventional thing. And so I think that's where that indie spirit still harkens back to. But yeah, as you were sort of saying that phrase, I was kind of chuckling to myself because I haven't really used that to describe myself in a while. But then you made me realize, no, actually, I think at heart, I guess I do identify as a scientist. And I guess if I have to be some kind of scientist at heart, then I am an indie scientist, because I think ultimately that does really go back to the music analogy. And then as you sort of said, like operating outside of the record labels, which at that time were the gatekeepers. So I guess I'm an eternal indie scientist if it means I'm looking to, bypass the gatekeepers.
Right. So I'm interested in your journey to here. Can you retrace how did you and for lack of a better word, let's stick to indie scientist. I know it's representing a collection of spirits and ethics to what you identify, but I'm interested in how did you sort of graduate from being within academia to what you're doing right now?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to a period of 2010 to 20, I think, 13, really actually probably 2010 to 2014. And that was sort of realizing at the tail end of my independent postdoc / fellowship that, the academic job market wasn't recovering, from the Great Recession, the way it had recovered from previous economic downturns, and that there was going to be this glut of postdocs, a postocalypse, as I called it, where you have roughly equally qualified people, vying for maybe 300 of them, 300 postdocs with really great, who are great scientists, maybe 30 of them, are basically indistinguishable, but they're still vying for one job. So that was kind of like the climate at that time, and it was pretty bleak. Funding had not gone up for a very long time, in the NIH and NSF, and that they did get sort of a bounce. But, there was a feeling that it was just going to be a slog. And so I started to use Twitter as an escape at first, a refuge, and then an educational center where I could learn about startups and entrepreneurship and learn about biotech and all aspects of biotech company creation, investing. So Twitter was that place where I could it was a transition zone between the academic world and the startup world. And by 2014, I'd kind of completed that transition into the startup world.
Okay. So you're almost sort of pushed to explore this by necessity of not having enough funding from the governmental agency. So are you talking about specifically in the bio domain, or generally this holds across the board in sciences?
I meant like, the funding of the NIH, the size of the NIH budget, the number of R01, so-called R01 grants, which are like the workhorse grants for that fund, the basic science that does become the bedrock of later medicines. So yeah, the funding situation as an independent associate professor was going to be challenging, or assistant professor, I think I should say. And so yeah, and then yeah, there was just this feeling of it was going to be a slog to get tenure, a slog to publish, and a slog to get grants. And I just started to think, well, I would rather do this fundraising process that I see startups doing, and kind of live and die by that process. Even though I came to learn it had a bunch of its own idiosyncrasies and flaws and inefficiencies, it still seemed, compared with the grant writing, process, it just seemed easier. And I find that funny now, because it certainly wasn't easy objectively, but it seemed relatively easier to pitch and create slides and have a conversation around getting funding than it did to the stilted form of writing with these page limits and these page formats and this font size and specific aims and all this stuff. And it seemed liberating to pitch.
Right. So when you were exploring getting outside the academia, were you concerned that your science will get impacted, or your pursuit or interest in science will sort of take a backseat? Because whenever someone is funding you, they have, especially in the startup world, they have different sort of criteria, especially financial returns and so on and so forth. So did you have any concern that outside of academia, maybe you'll not be able to do good quality science?
No, I had no concern about that. There was definitely concerns that you could get away with doing bad science, maybe in the startup world, and examples like Ubiome, show that can be true in these edge cases. But by and large, it felt like you could do hard science, deep tech, whatever the VCs wanted to call it. As a scientist, CEO, I never felt like I had to sort of either sugarcoat or gloss over or not do justice or dilute the science. I was getting funding for a very particular scientific thesis and approach to drug discovery. So and I looked around me and saw other founders getting funding for their bold ideas as well.
Okay. And also, I'm just going through my mental list of assumptions, what's good in academia, to see what, if there's anything you missed. One of the things is also the people you meet in academia, the collaboration that happened. Did you feel as an indie scientist outside of academia, you missed that part?
No, because there was great team science at Perlara. There was, we were operating in the Bay Area where we could go to seminars and talks at UCSF and Berkeley and Stanford. So, there was never this sense that I stopped being a scientist or stopped being a scientist at the highest level just because I wasn't operating in academia.
Okay. And what about lab access? Did you get, some things are really expensive for a startup to do by itself, and academia has great labs. So was that a constraint for your science?
No, because at the time, now everyone I think takes it for granted, but at the time, there were the first affordable biotech incubator spaces where you could rent lab space by the bench. And I think the first rate we paid was like $800 per month for a Newell. and I imagine the price is more like double today. But at that time, it felt like you could start out as a one-person company, a founder or just the founders, and that was the case back at what was called QB3 at 953. Now I think it's called MBC Biolabs, but that was a sparkling new Finnish incubator space with lab and office, and it was pretty glorious at the time because you say all academic lab space is great, but it depends. Some lab space in a new building is great, but lab in a lab space in a 40-year-old building is not maybe so great. So, but yeah, getting incubator space and growing bench by bench and incrementally. I can't remember what we were at our peak, but maybe it was 9 benches at some point from that first bench, and 2 office spaces and then other kind of communal, fractional communal space. So yeah, it was not difficult to get lab space, and I think now you just see that in biotech incubator model spread across many geographies. But at 2013, late 2013, when I kind of found out about them, they were still a new creature. It wasn't a new concept to have that kind of space, but it was the first time it seemed available to, I guess, entrepreneurs of my generation, biotech entrepreneurs of my generation.
Right. This brings me to this idea of decentralized bio that I think you're quite enthusiastic about, and you've detailed it on your Twitter. I've gone through your thread, and it's fantastic. The obvious parallels are to decentralized finance, but I'd love for you to describe what you mean by that and where do you see this going?
Yeah, so I'm not a DeFi devotee or an investor or expert in that way at all. But I've been aware of crypto for a while. For a decade, I've been aware of DeFi, I think, since 2017-ish. And I guess it just was always percolating in the back of my mind as something that needed to be incorporated into biotech. But yeah, that Twitter thread, I think, was a way for me to just kind of crystallize at a high level, I think, three core pillars or concepts of DeBi, decentralized biotech. And the first is that, we're talking about decentralizing operations. So we were just having a discussion now about lab space, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's probably why you kind of it naturally pivoted in this direction. So, if you're going to have a fully decentralized biotech operations, what does that mean? Well, it's not such a foreign object. It's something that we kind of see already today in hybrid form, which is that, there isn't just, it's not as though every company only sets up physical lab space with a physical office adjoining it and runs a core centralized lab with, full-time staff. That's not the only formula for making a biotech startup. There have been what are called virtual biotechs or asset-centric virtual biotechs. They've been around for a while. And I give full credit to those people, and pioneers in that space include David Granger over in the UK at Medici Ventures. So they kind of realized, yeah, we don't need to sign a lease on a centralized core lab and adjoining office. We can separate and unbundle all that. The management team can be in an office park somewhere, and the lab now no longer conjoined to the office, and the management team can be distributed across a network of CROs or other contract or sponsored research labs. I'm like, great, that's great, and that is definitely sort of decentralization by a different name. Again, they call it the virtualization or outsourcing, but I think we're pretty much again, biotech companies. I think newcos are still, for the most part, even in some instances, companies are kind of in stealth mode in the beginning and operated in a more decentralized, distributed way, and then they kind of coalesce and centralize sort of after they exit stealth mode or after they get like a large bolus of capital. So it's sort of like they're decentralized, but only temporarily or like developmentally. They're not as adult companies, remaining decentralized. So the concept of fully decentralized operations means that you would never sort of sign a lab lease and have office space next to it. Like that concept would just seem revolting or just seem bizarre. And that sounds crazy in biotech, but in tech, now that living the pandemic, companies like Coinbase and others are saying, hey, we're fully remote now as a company. There is no HQ, Coinbase
Right.
HQ, that's going to be on Market Street or some other, downtown location, like the way it was done in the past. It's fully remote. And so why wouldn't that work with biotech? I mean, again, you can show me examples of fully virtualized biotech companies today that operate basically in this, that didn't call it remote first, but have been doing this, where the management team is not co-located, where the R&D is, distributed. But again, that's a minority, a small number of biotechs, take that form today. But again, what is stopping it, remote first from being just the rule, not the exception? So I just see it's simply a matter of time. So that's kind of the operations piece. You got to decentralize that pillar. Does that make sense?
Right. I mean, I was just I was just drawing parallels to what happened in tech, especially with servers, where companies
Bingo.
used to have racks of servers and they had to take an office to just keep servers. But now hardly anyone gets their own servers. It's all in the cloud. So it would
Right.
be very hard to imagine that if companies of the past had their own lab space, now you could outsource a lot of it and virtualize it so that contract agencies or other folks do it for you. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. So other folks can do it. They can do it in like distributed brick and mortar labs. You could have finally the fruition of cloud labs. My good friends at Emerald Cloud Lab, it's a long slog to build this concept, but where you could basically push code and run experiments that way, and it's not just that you're pushing the experiments off onto other, like a network of labs. You're literally pushing code that then is executed by robotics. And there's some humans in the loop, of course, but essentially you've got these automated experiment workflows. Wow. that will just do this on command, literally on code commands, and then you get data back. So yeah, I think you're going to see the spread of these cloud labs, and they'll start to take root. And just like as you said, you move away from your own server racks to the cloud, you're going to move R&D. Biotechs will move R&D to cloud labs. I think there's going to be an equilibrium and a balance. I don't think it's going to be 50-50, but there's going to be some amount of automation that's still done locally, because there's always going to be a bespoke element to doing experiments, where some ideas can't just be run through an existing automated workflow. You have to kind of do a bespoke experiment. But you can imagine physical labs will be like the prototyping spaces, the proof of concept spaces, and then they quickly get packaged up into experiments that can be run on these automated workflows. And you can spin up new automated workflows and new assembly lines of experiment workflows if you just swap in this instrument for that instrument, or you changed. And then it becomes like building a car in an assembly line, right. And that's how experiments are built.
And as a startup, if a lot of time is being spent on your desk researching papers, then perhaps you could just hire a lab for a week or a day or even an hour to do that specific experiment versus hiring it, forever.
Right, exactly. So you want to spin up some server space or some a cloud instance. You can just do that fractionally on demand. But then I see there's going to be this relationship between things, moving to the cloud lab and being out of physical control of the scientists who are devising experiments. And then there still is going to be, I think, like I said, local experiments and local automation and local robotics that will assist that, so that, there will be some balance between a scientist sort of their thinking time and their and their experiment time. But their experiment time won't be manual, tedious pipetting and that kind of repetitive behavior or activities. It will be sort of more, the way that high energy experimental physicists do experiments and are basically, upkeeping the machines that are running analyses or running the experiments, but they're still in the lab setting and they're still ideating in that context.
In your opinion for
operation.
sorry, I was asking in bespoke experiments, where does that fit in for decentralized bio scheme? Will everyone in the company who's remote have his or her own lab space in that city, or?
I mean, that's a great question. I think what you're going to see is there'll be this interesting dynamic. Well, maybe there'll be pop-up labs and pop-up spaces, or you go to short-term or flexible lab leases that are more project-based or demand-based. And when demand surges, you kind of surge the space. It's hard to talk about this in a formulaic way because each biotech startup is going to be doing something different. But yeah, I think if you imagine that you can have, you can have this decentralization where you're in cloud labs, or you're in a network of brick and mortar R&D, but then you've also got decentralization at the kind of local scale where, the way your experiment workflow is constructed, it's of modular plug and play parts. And so in that sense, you've got the kind of decentralization in the experiment workflow where, bits of it can be broken up into modules or, into pieces, and then kind of either recombined, or those can be done at separate places and then spliced and re-edited locally. So I think there's going to be this, because the talk about foundries and places where other people are going to essentially build pipes to do experiments for you. That's going to be great and solve a lot of problems. But then I think there's always going to be a need to have local experiments because of a need for bespokeness, or because of just meeting a local or timely demand. But doing it a way where when you do local experiments, you're doing it in a decentralized modular plug and play fashion. And so you're never sort of fully encumbering yourself with you're trying to avoid fully encumbering yourself with full-time FTEs or with sort of long-term, 6 months or longer sort of physical, commitments in forms of leases or other things that tie you down to a specific geography or location.
Right. So getting back to the pillars of decentralized bio, one you talked about is this decentralization of operations. Are there more pillars? I guess you were talking about 3 pillars.
Yeah, so there's 3 pillars here. So the second pillar is really the management team. And I wanted to talk about decentralizing management teams. The management teams are sort of implicitly a centralized sort of concept. And I think this is a different pillar than operations, as you'll sort of see. Because so I'll give you the example, sort of how the way Perlara is doing it, to kind of make the larger point. So in Perlara 1.0, everyone was a full-time employee basically, and there were a few consultants brought on, to fill in knowledge gaps or expertise gaps. But basically, it was a core a set of full-time FTEs that had this core expertise that were coming in and executing on this core function. I was building a management team that was, again, physically co-located with them, and sort of, just operating on the traditional sort of, 9 to 5, although it was always never 9 to 5, but we were kind of operating that type of, communications, between team members, and expectations of people are going to grow into roles over time and become more expert at those things that they can physically kind of do in the lab. So when I talk about decentralizing the management team, now I'm saying, and the team sort of broadly, what I'm saying is that you first kind of flip the concept of everybody being full-time on its head, and you say, now actually the default is that everybody is part-time or fractional, and that there's now a minority of full-time folks, but those folks are going to be probably more in a support role and an operations role. kind of managing the back office, if you will, managing the online productivity tools, scheduling obviously meetings, but also scheduling meetups, so that we have a truly hybrid, remote first, but still hybrid sort of team. And then you're also sort of flipping on its head this idea that everybody has to be sort of full time and quote unquote 100% devoted to the effort. Otherwise, you won't kind of create company culture. Otherwise, you won't get productivity. Well, what if you flip that on its head and say, well, let's instead of building this centralized full-time team of scientists that all have to kind of show up at this one location and do science over this fine over business working hours set by our local time zones. Now instead, what if you have this distributed sort of science workforce that can be activated sort of any time of day depending on where they are, and they can be anywhere in the world. And what if you can now add up like the 5 to 10 spare CPU cycles that every one of these scientists has? Let's imagine we're talking about the tens of thousands of PhD scientists around the world. What if each of them could spare 5 to 10 hours a week, on a genetic disease, let's say, because that's what Perlara's interest is. You bundle all of those hours together, and that's an impressive sort of productivity potential, and it's a pretty impressive workforce where you don't have to pay any of the overhead to assemble this team, and you actually solve the company culture problem because you have this mission alignment around helping families with genetic diseases that kind of sort of makes up for the fact that you have to be remote first, because everyone is so compelled by this mission that we tolerate this interaction because we know at heart that we're driven by something that really is important. And then if we sprinkle in enough face-to-face and meetups, because inevitably, there's a bunch of people that are in hubs because that's where people are. And so it'd be very natural to be able to kind of have on-demand meetups among these teams. And then it doesn't have to be like, well, every Monday it's Meetup Monday and we have to meet up, to check the box of being this hybrid team. It's like, no, what if you algorithmically, can kind of figure out and optimize for scheduling and meetups, so that you're actually serving the productivity of the company and figuring out, well, these people need to meet up now because there's some important deadline, but otherwise they meet at this other kind of, less frequent cadence. And you kind of, and on the fly, almost like a logistics company, you're looking at your own company and saying, how are all these distributed nodes that I've assembled? How am I going to put all the time, their hours together, their expertise, so that they work on the right projects at the right time? How do I solve that problem? And so that's what I mean by decentralized team. And that's not just like, again, I want to distinguish between like, you have a core group of people on a management team that are all full time, and they may be managing other scientists that are located other places in other time zones, sure. But it's like they're managing them in kind of this B2B way, where it's like, well, I've got our organization and we're managing the science happening in this contract research organization. And it's kind of this B2B interaction. I'm saying, as an example, we've got this global workforce that you can activate and form teams, to work on projects together. That's, again, fundamentally a flipped concept of how you would set up a team. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I have lots of questions on it. I would love to, just to be clear, and for the benefit of listeners, Perlara is your startup and you work on finding cures for rare genetic diseases. Am I right?
Yeah. And so the way we're doing that in this, so to be really concrete, is we've set up this Cure Sherpa model. And what that says is, as I was kind of describing in the past few minutes without calling it so, but what if you could say to PhD scientists around the world, hey, do you have 5 to 10 hours a week that you can spare, or maybe even less than 1 to 10 hours a week you can spare, maybe even up to 20 hours. If you have 1 to 20 hours a week you can spare, to like work with other scientists like you who can be paired up and guide families up the mountain to their treatments and cures. And so that means you're going to create a cure roadmap for them, a strategic sort of research and investment plan. You're going to manage research and set up a research network for them and manage that research and analyze data and you're going to try to identify a drug or a clinical candidate that can be taken into a first-in-human study as quickly as possible. So that's the guided cure. That's this journey you have to help families on. So Cure Sherpas, again, they're going to be part-time. They already have the first cohort that I'm assembling of about 17 or 18. And they're already representing 5 to 6 different countries, or 5 to 6 states in the United States, just from this initial sort of call for Sherpas. And I can kind of imagine that you put out the call and this grows, that there's going to be lots and lots of other people among the tens of thousands of PhDs around the world that are alive today that have some kind of biology background. That's kind of the goal, is to activate them into this Cure Sherpa force and then match them up with families, and potentially also act as a broker and match families with companies and investors who want to get into genetic diseases but are scared, or they need more understanding and visibility into those diseases. And Perlara can provide that kind of visibility and de-risking.
So families approach Perlara, families with someone who has a rare genetic disease, and you assemble small teams of PhD students working. PhDs,
not students, PhDs.
Okay.
They could be as young as just finished freshly minted PhDs. They could be mid-career folks like me who are now, I got my PhD in 2006, so I'm 15 years post PhD. But I'm in this first cohort of Cure Sherpas. There are scientists who are just wrapping up their PhD. Now, or have just wrapped it up. So we've got that spread.
So these PhDs then design a roadmap for these families to help figure out whether an existing drug can work for their condition, or maybe a drug that is in clinical trials.
That's right. Repurposing is one sort of aspect of the roadmap exercise, but it also includes proposing other therapeutic tracks, other modalities, things that are not as fast as repurposing to the clinic, but things that you need to have as like your next generation therapy, or your second wave and then your third wave of interventions and treatments. And ultimately, these things will stack up to be cures or curative, or the early versions of the repurposed drugs, which will end up being bridge therapies, will then be kind of succeeded and replaced by a better in class, drug that will take longer to develop. So the roadmap really covers all therapeutic strategies and suggests a multiple modality, kind of modality agnostic. You're not just going to go all in on one strategy like gene therapy or small molecules or whatnot, but you're going to go into multiple modalities, generate a portfolio, and also have these kind of staggered development milestones where it's going to, you anticipate a year 1 set of interventions and treatments, then in year 2, and then in year 3, and then they stack, and then you approach sort of what would be a cure or a curative set of medicines.
Right. And this seems like a very hard problem to solve because, I'm assuming
Indeed.
Different PhDs have different skill sets, and different diseases would require different sorts of approaches. And there are so many variables for a potential cure and a good science to come out of this. So at a very high level, how do you sort of form teams or mix up math skills? It just seems a lot of balls in the air to do this right.
Yeah, as I said, it's like a logistics problem, because it's like not just time and space and setting up meetings or calls, but also, you've got hours of Cure Sherpa time available. You have hours of work required, to on these guided cures, starting with cure roadmap exercises. You've got different expertises, but part of the tension you want to have here is the fresh eyes of a PhD scientist, who just doesn't know this field in the details, but can come in and, the way, like the same reason why you bring in management consultants, versus people who might have tangential expertise. So know the nomenclature, know the kind of bedrock understanding, but don't know like all the details. And then they'll as the Sherpa force grows, and eventually you'll have kind of a proximal expert to any given disease that pops up. There will be somebody out there who's the closest sort of match based on, degree of already existing understanding. But I think we want to have a tension there between having people who already know everything about this field, because the reality is the groups and families we work with, they often already assemble and find the researchers out there who are the experts in their gene. So they've already, there's no need to recreate that expertise. What we need to do is create efficient and ego-free data transfer and sort of mind melding between the experts, those handful of experts in that gene of disease, and like the Sherpa force that comes in. And it's like, how do we work together so that, we don't have to relearn and reinvent all the problems of the field. We can kind of do a download with the few experts in that gene or pathway. And then with the fresh eyes and with our strategic kind of, sort of start to summit kind of perspective, we can craft a real multi-year, drug development plan, aka roadmap.
Right. And solving these logistical problems of mixing and matching, is that someone who's full-time with you, or is that also someone?
No, so that's what's being done on the fly. So this is really so Perlara 1.0 was an experiment, and still in the confines of a centralized biotech. We ran a bunch of experiments and did a lot of things that made us different. One of them was kind of cultivate and care about community, these families and foundations, and seeing them as partners, not just either people that will provide funds or people that you're just going to do experiments on at some point to get a trial underway. So Perlara 2.0 is an experiment as well, where I think algorithmically we can solve the problem of like mixing and matching, and these free Sherpa hours and these hours of work that need to be done. And so I think in the beginning it can be manual, and like this problem is complicated, but ultimately it's like a problem that gets solved right now by airlines that are routing planes across networks of hubs and spoke. It's solved by Uber and other ride shares, where it's like, hey, a Cure Sherpa is driving a car and you want to ride, right? Jump in. Well, you have to have the destination. You pop it. I mean, this analogy breaks down very quickly, but the point is, managing logistics. I think we're going to go through an evolution of doing it manually, because this is still something that can be done at a manual, quasi-automated scale. And then as it starts to grow beyond this, put in place structures and processes and protocols that are ultimately streamlined and automated, that allow for kind of seamless mixing and matching and solving these logistics problems that will be inherent. So just to be clear, obviously every decentralized company and then decentralized biotech in particular will have to solve these kinds of logistics problems. That will just be the new problems of decentralized companies, just like they were kind of problems that centralized companies had to face, no matter what their sector or vertical. So there will be, you imagine, other players in the ecosystem that will rise up to help, service and provide, support to decentralized companies as they just create or become a larger share of companies overall.
Right. And like you said, for some of the diseases, the cure roadmap will be for multiple years. So are you expecting Sherpas to come and go in between and almost being sort of, for lack of a better word, replaceable? Because for a part-time person sticking with a project for 4 years seems a little difficult.
Exactly. So there's this, I don't like that word replaceability, but
I know. That's why I said lack for a better word. I don't like it either.
I think, I mean, we can kind of come up with a better word, but I think the way I frame it is, we want to create, if DeBi is really to meet its true expression, it's going to be a leaderless protocol, right? And so in that sense, like, it's not going to depend on me, and it's not going to, and therefore it's not going to depend on any, it's not going to have single point failure as sort of a vulnerability, which I just think is kind of interesting to think about, that companies will be sort of run off of this, what we're building here is kind of this protocol, and that in the future, companies will just be run off of this protocol, and they'll customize and they'll do other things to meet their specific scientific needs, but they'll basically be running this protocol, which will again be kind of like a blueprint for how you do decentralized operations, how you do decentralized teams, And then, of course, the big one is how you do decentralized finance, because that's the third pillar of DeBi is decentralizing the cap table. And maybe, I guess, in our remaining time, I suppose we'll want to explore that pillar, because I think that's really well. No, maybe I don't know if you had any questions or any sort of preface to that.
Maybe one last question before we explore decentralized finance. You talked about solving this like logistical issue, almost like Uber does. But the intuition of science is that it's not as predictable in terms of how it progresses. So how are you? I'm not sure what your thoughts on it, but fundamentally, this seems not so easily chunkable into very predictable steps. But has your experience been otherwise?
Well, I think what we're trying to do is we're clearing a bunch of paths. And once we've cleared them, then others can kind of follow without those same upfront infrastructure costs or without running into those kind of unexpected results or those setbacks or those roadblocks. Hopefully those only need to be cleared once. So I do think that these processes will become more chunkable, more shrinkable over time. So, because I think at the end of the day, where the modalities are going is to a place of modularity, right? So, or programmability, right? Think about the mRNA vaccines. We're now in a place where you can program up a new medicine by just typing up a different sequence that becomes the payload. So in a world where the medicines themselves are intrinsically programmable and designable and modular, then I think that sort of reflects back on the R&D process and the operations, and those themselves will also be kind of correspondingly chunkable and modular, because then it's going to become predictable, more manufacture and create RNAs in the case of that kind of medicine. But with gene editors or base editors or prime editing, I think you're going to see that there's going to be like a playbook and a recipe book for how you implement these intrinsically programmable medicines. And so I think that will just that programmability will end up being reflected in the supply chain and in the kind of R&D that supports it, because you'll be able to break those up into corresponding chunks as well.
Okay, so for certain types of scientific projects, it will work beautifully, but for others, it might not. I mean, if there's some basic fundamental research is required, then probably this model may not work.
I mean, I don't know. I think I would say that if more basic research is more like analogous to in computer science with these like truly open source efforts where nobody truly owns it, but enough people tend the communal garden that it kind of it doesn't spoil, it doesn't get overrun by weeds and so forth. So I think it's possible that you could manage you can manage very basic science projects in a decentralized way as well. But you're right. I think at the end of the day, we don't want to be prescriptive about this. That's why I said when it comes to operations, it will all trend toward decentralized, but whether it's going to be sort of, what that balance is of the local spin, pop up on demand sort of, physical lab infrastructure that's required to get certain projects done versus what you can just push as code and have done on Cloud Labs and sent back to you as just data. Like there's always going to be that natural sort of plug back ebb and flow, and what needs to be done to get research done kind of locally and where you need to control it versus where the experiments are fundamentally commoditized, and you can then just sort of distribute them in a much more market efficient way.
Got it. Okay, so back to third pillar, we have decentralized operations, decentralized teams. Who's funding all of this?
Right. So I think you kind of think about this from the point of view of a cap table, and also in terms of like, is this business profitable sort of, from day one or not? And therefore, if it's bootstrapping or profitable, then it can kind of forego the cap table entirely in some ways. And in biotech, as we all kind of know, it's sort of not really possible to, that's what we're told, is that it's not possible to sort of, be profitable from day one. In fact, it's not something you're supposed to do anyway. You're supposed to just get some science to work, and either it makes a drug or it doesn't. It's like very binary. And if you're trying to make profit or make money, well, then you're just a CRO, right? That's not an interesting, kind of business. But I think in the DeBi model, profitability is rewarded, and I think the easiest way that any scientist actually can become sort of profitable is if they monetize themselves and their expertise as consultants. And so I think what's interesting about sort of the finance side is, you want to decentralize the cap table, but you also want to potentially bypass it if you don't need it. And so if you take the concept from tech, where it's like where unit profitability and getting product market fit and being in a ramen profitability period where you're intentionally lean and reinvesting your profits back into sort of customer acquisition or product development or whatnot, like that kind of micro scale, single scale sort of the entrepreneur or the tinkerer, like that model, I think needs to start to blossom in biotech. And DeBi, I think, allows for that, because it says, hey, if you can, set yourself up shop as like PhD so-and-so with this expertise, someone's going to pay you for your time. And especially if you're able to now, fly your banner internationally, globally, virtually, online, there'll be somewhere at some time who would want to tap into your expertise, and figuring out ways to plug into them. That's solving that same kind of mixing, matching problem that just has to be solved in any decentralized type of network. But I think what's, if you kind of move now beyond this minimalist, starting point of you can be profitable, by just monetizing your PhD and becoming a creator. I mean, we used to call that a consultant, so maybe I'm just rebranding creators. But where I think you start to decentralize the cap table is where you say, well, how do I put money in? Let's start with the seed money. How do I get that funding in without having to rely on, right now, the traditional sort of, gatekeepers that are allowing biotech to take shape? And to be fair, like, it's a very, very generous seed market right now in biotech. And I think lots of people with credible ideas, even if they're fresh out of their PhD or dropping out of their PhD, can raise several $1 million now from Bay Area, mostly Bay Area networks of angels, incubators, YC and so forth. So but it's still a centralized cap table at the end of the day. And they're still going to have to like put together a syndicate, and they're going to have to like manage that cap table, manage those investor relations. So what would happen if you could get funding from crypto markets? And we see example, and obviously the initial coin offering has kind of been tainted, I guess, in its early days by excess and abuse or just excess, as happens with every new technology and early adoption. So I wouldn't get thrown by that. But the concept that you can kind of that a hardcore community can kind of band together and sort of figure out a way to access crypto markets, access crypto financing, access crypto liquidity, take advantage of staking, even just getting donations from interest on people's staked holdings. I think there's lots of clever, and of course issuing certain tokens and thinking about it in that level as well. But just fundamentally, the idea that there's over $1 trillion in crypto market cap, most of that is just being hodled and not being put to work. And if you could put that to work the way we do in traditional markets, where you can kind of create liquidity, then what would you put that money to work toward? And if you could put to work on projects like solving diseases on the long tail, where there could be return, but it's uncertain, and it's also likely to happen in a longer time horizon than traditional centralized funding sources want. And LPs, limited partners, want their 3 to 5x in 3 to 5 years. And now with IPO markets as hot as they are, they just want IPOs. From Series C to IPO in 18 months is like the new model. I think that hysteria is going to come to a close at some point. The generalists are in the biotech markets for good post-COVID, so that's not changing. But I do think that there are going to be ways to finance your company, that those first $10 million, where you can rely on crypto and crypto markets and liquidity providers, a different type of LP that I think can allow for these long tail projects to be financed more reliably. Because otherwise, these families have to go fund me each and every time. Otherwise, they have to kind of beg, borrow, and steal. They have to get the attention of a biotech or some other company, which may then eventually abandon the IP or abandon the program if it's not worth their while. So it's right. Sort of, they're very powerless right now. And I think the great thing about DeFi is how it's made kind of broken down those barriers and given power now to quote unquote retail investors. And so I think the same thing has to happen on biotech, but also more so to empower the founders and primarily give them alternate sorts of capital where they're not beholden to the VC model.
Right. So in your case for Perlara, have you explored these non-traditional ways of financing, or are you planning to explore?
So in terms of the DeBi experiment, that third pillar, the financing, is the last one, and the one that's going to take last to deploy and longest to incubate. So the operations is already sort of the solved problem. The team is the one that's the current experiment. And I think sort of heading into 2022, I want to do a lot of thinking and planning over the next 6 months so that we start implementing some of these experiments on the financing side in 2022. But I think a lesson learned from Perlara 1.0 is don't change too many variables at once. Sort of change one axis at a time and hold other things constant while you do that. So as I said, we've got operations decentralized. That's from day one. The team decentralization is this ongoing experiment, and then decentralizing the finance piece is sort of that last leg of the stool. But right now Perlara is profitable because again, it's set up with this sort of Sherpa model, and basically Sherpa plus SaaS means it's got unit economics that are profitable from day one. So I want to make sure that scales as we scale the team, and the team is fully decentralized in that process. And then think about what are the smart, thoughtful ways to deploy crypto financing, in kind of this next iteration,
right.
This next evolution.
So you said you're profitable as families are paying for the operations directly for doing the research.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Exactly.
Okay. So Ethan, I know we are end of our time. So just last question. Why did you set it up as a public benefit company?
So I set it up initially. Sorry, I'm getting these slacks here. I set it up as a public benefit company because at that time I thought that was going to be the way to really be patient-centered and patient driven, because that was that's been the talk of biopharma for all this time, is how patient-centered and patients at the center. So I just thought that one way to put your money where your mouth was to set the company up as a PBC, and that in itself was an experiment that I've got lessons that are, I think, both sort of positive and lessons that are a little disappointing, in the sense that the short of it is, the TLDR is, I think it didn't, I think being a PBC was important for branding and community building, which is something we prioritize that most biotechs don't prioritize. I think where it was a little disappointing was that we didn't seemingly spark a movement of other PBCs, and there certainly are other PBCs out there, but there's still sort of a kind of, I think, seen as like a parlor trick or just this oddity. And so I guess it's a little disappointing that it didn't sort of generate more traction. And, whatever role I played and Perlara 1.0 played in not generating enough of that momentum, I take responsibility, I guess, for that. But I guess who's to say what's going to happen in the next 10 years? But yeah, I would say that definitely being a PBC and actually trying to walk the walk in terms of putting patients first and making them co-owners and seeing them as potential drug developers and co-owners, I think we kind of check that box. And then to be seen what happens with others who want to use this PBC vehicle, and whether, there are other things that get stacked on top of being a PBC, like investment or tax advantages that so far don't exist. If you incorporate that way, that maybe that will help tip the balance. But in the end, I think it doesn't really matter. It's not about, you could set up an organization as a DAO, right? And like, as long as, depends on who the membership is of the governance body. And I think it all comes down to that. You can be an LLC, a C Corp, they're all going to have kind of governance body roles, and it's all about who is those people that are running it. And that, so it's less, to me, it's less about the vehicle and more about who the drivers are.
Right. Thank you so much, Ethan. This has been a fantastic dive into so many related topics. I wish Perlara all the best, and I hope you end up publishing this really nice guide for thousands of other companies to follow in your footsteps. And we end up solving a lot of scientific problems in this decentralized way.
Well, I really appreciate the powerful conversation. And definitely going to be posting updates on this DeBi journey on Twitter. And hopefully we'll be using other venues like On Deck and Clubhouse to sort of spread the DeBi gospel.
Great. Thanks, Ethan. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you again for having me. Bye.